stew. When you make beef stew, it wouldn't be quite realistic to think that the ingredients weren't going to mix together. It's not beef salad. So you've got the potatoes, and they're covered with some kind of brownish red something that you imagine comes from the beef, and you've got the peas, and the carrots are soft and they don't taste like carrots, and everything is mixed together. And often in a stew, these little things where you don't really remember what they are. Maybe it's parsnips, but you didn't actually use any parsnips, and they're these little things where you would have to take it to a lab to figure out what it was, because everything is mixed together. That's how it works with stew, and that's the way it also works with languages. And so after we know that there are 6,000 languages, that they're always changing, that change produces dialects of all of those languages, then we can go on to learn that the next step is that all of the world's languages, or better, all of the dialects of all of the world's languages, mix with each other. And that's been a natural process. So far, my implication has been that the natural history of language is like a bush, and it began with one trunk that branched into a mass of twigs decorated with leaves. But that metaphor can actually only take us so far. Really, it's more like stew. Now, of course, that analogy only works so well because now it seems like I'm talking about this bush that is covered with this dinty moor. We're going to have to come up with something better. We'll work on that in later lectures. But for now, just remember that there is all of this mixture. This time, we're going to talk about the mixture on the level of words. This is the most intuitive way that languages mix. For most of us, it's in fact just the beginning. Languages also mix in terms of their grammar, and a lot. But it does begin with words. So, an example. English's vocabulary is bastard. We are a bastard language in terms of our vocabulary. We're just talking. We don't think about this as we speak online. But actually, we have a vocabulary of extremely mixed origins. So, for example, we are used to going into a dictionary and finding that a word traces back to Latin, French, Dutch, Greek. If it traces back to Old English, that's almost the unexpected case. We assume that we're going to be taking this long trip around Europe and even other parts of the world and figuring out where even ordinary words of English came from. But actually, this is something that is more common for we English speakers than for people who speak many other languages. If you're a Pole, for example, you go into the dictionary, and most of the time you find out that your basic words came from a Slavic ancestral language. It's not really that exciting, as opposed to French and Dutch and all these other places. We have a particular experience with English, and that's because out of all the words in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is considered a relatively representative, comprehensive sample of all of the words that we have, it's been said that 99% were taken from other languages. And so that leaves only 1% of words that trace back to the original Old English rootstock. Now, as it happens, those words are also 62% of the words that are most used. So if you actually imagine the Oxford English Dictionary, you can imagine various words that are there that are not used very often, etc. This is all of the levels of vocabulary. In terms of the words that are most used in spoken language in particular, these are 62% Old English. And so that's things like and, but, father, love, fight, to, will, should, not, from, words like that. However, most of our vocabulary actually came from somewhere else. So how English began and where English is now in terms of words are vastly divergent phenomena. And so it's not only the rather obvious things like sushi. Well, golly, I wonder if that's a Japanese word. Well, we know. Taco. I wonder if the original Old English speakers had a word tajum or something like that. No, taco is a borrowing from Spanish. And then, of course, there are words like adjacent. A lot of us sense, well, that must be one of these Latinate words that we hear. That's one of the so-called big words. But actually, it's a lot more thorough a permeation than that. So, for example, well, I might take a sentence like this one. Yet the vast majority of our vocabulary originated in foreign languages, including not merely the obvious Latinate items like adjacent, but common mundane forms not processed by us as continental in the slightest. Now, in that sentence, every word longer than 3 letters is not English. And so to give emphasis, it would be, yet the vast majority of our vocabulary originated in foreign languages, including not merely the obvious Latinate items like adjacent, but common, mundane forms not processed by us as continental in the slightest. All the words pronounced on the higher pitch are foreign. Now, we wouldn't think of that, but that's how bastard our vocabulary is. Now, where did all these words come from? Take a little trip through the history of the language to get a sense of the layers. The first major incursion was when Vikings from Scandinavia took over the northern half of the island of Britain starting in 787 AD. They spoke Old Norse. Old Norse and Old English were closely related languages. They were both Germanic languages. They were about as close as Spanish and Italian, or maybe even Spanish and Portuguese. They were different languages, but they were close. But the Vikings did not speak Old English. They spoke a different language. And Old Norse was the ancestor of what is today the Scandinavian languages, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, not to mention Icelandic, which is very similar to it. But at this point, there was only Old Norse, and these other languages hadn't arisen yet, just as modern English hadn't arisen yet, and that's what the Vikings were speaking. The Vikings didn't only come and beat people up. They came and stayed, and they married into the society and blended in. They were kind of kinder, gentler barbarians. And as a result, there were many, many Old Norse words that were brought into English, about 1,000 by one count. And this is basic stuff, so it wasn't Viking things, but it was basic words like both, same, again, get, give, the form are for to be, you are. That are comes from Old Norse. Sky, skin. These are not original English words. These are Scandinavian words. And sometimes they even gave us interesting doublets. So our original word was shirt, and then they had a word skirt. Those two words were cognates. They were the same word in the two languages, closely related. And as it happened, shirt came to mean something that is on top of you, and then skirt was used to refer to something that is usually, if you're a conventional dresser, on the bottom of you. But originally, they are the same word. Skirt's from the Scandies, and shirt was original. And there are other doublets like that. So that's the first kind of boat rocking that we get. Then, starting in 1066 AD, there was the occupation of England by French speakers. Specifically, it was the Normans, and their dialect was not the standard, but a different dialect of French. The Normans were descended from Vikings too. Norman was a form of Norse men. The Vikings had decisively affected history throughout Western Europe for a long time, and the region that is now France was no exception. So in a way, it was another Viking invasion, except these were people at a different level of civilization. And so the Normans took over England for roughly 200 years, and as a result, the official language of England, so to speak, was French. And so this was the language that was used in the government, this was what was used in the court, this was the language that was used most often in writing. So at this point, there's a time when documents in English become rather rare because French is the language in England, of all places. Now, as a result of this contact, there were a great many French words that were borrowed into English, and we're never going to give them back. As a matter of fact, there were, according to one count, 7,500 words of this kind. And these are words like air, coast, debt, face, flower, joy, people, river, sign, blue, clear, easy, large, mean, nice, poor, carry, change, cry, move, push, save, trip, wait.